Today you're going to learn about something called data types when it comes to PHP. And data types is essentially something that we use constantly whenever we do anything inside PHP, since it's the type of data that we manipulate in order to get different results. So when it comes to data types inside PHP, we have about 12 different primitive data types. So we're not going to talk about all of them in this episode here. It will be slightly overwhelming if we do that. So we're just going to focus on the one called scalar types, which is 4 of the different data types that we have. Now, scalar data types are the ones we use most of the time when it comes to PHP, and those involve strings, integers, floats, and booleans. And now we did briefly talk about strings in the previous episode when we learned how to echo something inside the browser to output something. So we're just going to get started with strings, and then we're going to continue on talking about the different data types one by one. So when it comes to strings, there's 2 different ways we can do it. Either we can wrap strings inside double quotes like we did in the previous episode, or we can wrap them inside single quotes. Now the difference here, or at least the reason we have 2 different types of quotes, is the fact that sometimes if I were to wrap something inside double quotes, let's say a SQL query that I want to send to a database, when it comes to SQL, we sometimes need to wrap some of the data inside the SQL string inside single quotes. That means that if I were to use double quotes inside my double quotes, I essentially cancel out the outer double quotes. So we need to be able to use 2 different types of quotes inside our string in some cases. And just to give an example here, if you were to take a look at the string that is behind me, you can actually see that we have 2 different strings. In the one where we use single quotes, you'll notice that inside the string itself, we do have a word called I'm. Now, sometimes in English, when we want to combine 2 words together to make it shorter, like I am or I'm, we sometimes use single quotes. And therefore, when we use that single quote, it will cancel out one of the quotes that we use around the actual string. Therefore, we need to do something called to escape that single quote. And we do that by using a backslash right in front of the quote symbol. And by doing this, we actually escape that single quote so it isn't registered as one of the quotes that goes around it. So if you do have an example where you do need to use single quotes, but you also need to use a single quote inside your string, you can escape quotes by actually using a backslash. In this next example here, you can actually see that we're trying to echo out integers inside the browser. And as you can see, when it comes to integers, we don't do it in the same way as with strings. We don't have to wrap it inside something. We just simply need to write the number and then it's registered as an integer. Do bear in mind, this is without using the punctuation to make decimal points behind it. If it's just a whole number, then we're talking about integers here. And I should probably mention that if you want to use an integer and you want to wrap it inside quotation marks, just like we do with strings, it will technically still be a number, but it's a number that's a string data type. It's a different data type than an integer. So if I were to, in some example in the future, say that I want to compare 2 numbers together, and I want to compare a number 10, that is an integer data type, with a number 10 that is a string data type. If I want to check if these are the same, we can do so by matching just a number. But we can also go ahead and do something where we check if they're the same number and if they're the same data type. And this is something that is going to be useful in the future when we do different error handlings and such things that allow for us to make sure the user submits the right data when we want to do something with data from users. In the next example, you can see we have something called a float, and a float is essentially just a number that has decimal points behind it. So I did write a couple of different examples on the board here so you can actually see what is going on, and these are essentially what floats are. Now, I should probably also mention that if you come from a different programming background, let's say something like the C languages or C# or something, then in those languages we were to define a float by putting an F behind the number. Whereas when it comes to PHP, we don't need to put an F behind a float number, we just simply write out the float with decimal points. In the next example here, we have something called a Boolean, and a Boolean is also something we use quite often when it comes to PHP. A Boolean is essentially just a true or false statement where we can go in and check if a certain condition using PHP code has been true or false, meaning that we can decide if we want to run a block of code depending on a certain condition that might have been met. So we use true or false statements all the time when it comes to PHP. And if you don't quite see the purpose behind Booleans for now, just don't worry about it. You will see plenty of examples in the future where we start using Booleans in order to check for certain conditions inside our code. So for now, don't worry about it if you don't quite get what I meant when I said conditions and such. So other than that, I think this is pretty much what I want to talk about when it comes to different data types, or at least the scalar data types. We'll get into the other ones in the future once we do actually get past a certain point, since there are other data types that you have to know about. But for now, this is all I think you should worry about. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you in the next one.